Arsenal Cell. I'm sure you'd all like to welcome them.
Hi, thank you for inviting us. Ian's just going to get us set up with the audio-visual technology. We're going to do a shared presentation like we had earlier, but we're going to do a bit more chopping and changing. So Ian's going to talk, and I'm going to talk, then Ian's going to talk, and then I'm going to talk.
We actually got radio connection.
In terms of questions, I'm sure we would both definitely take questions at the end. If there's something that's really not clear, then please ask at the time, because it means we haven't explained it properly. But if they're more general questions, then maybe hold those to the end when we've got time set aside for questions.
Okay,
With both
thank you very much, Tristan.
I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. So, I should introduce myself. I'm Dr. Ian Frayling. I'm the UK's only genetic pathologist, and I'm in post in the University Hospital Wales in Cardiff. I'm truly honoured to be your honorary medical advisor. That actually carries very considerable clout when I have to argue things in committee rooms, because I represent you, and I feel a responsibility. So, Ranjit gave an absolutely brilliant talk, and I agree, we need the likes of his good self on the team, so I'm going to grab him before he goes, make sure he's part of what we call the Mallorca group.
You might have to get him a cue though.
Sorry? Yeah, all right, I will. So, if you'll permit me, I've got a little cartoon here, which a picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'll just... It's a cartoon of how DNA mismatch repair sorts out errors in DNA. Now, there's DNA polymerase, and it made a little mistake. So MSH2 and MSH6 find that, and they bind to the DNA little donut, and it recruits MLH1 and PMS2, and it knocks off the polymerase that just made the mistake, and then a little thing comes in like a Pac-Man and chews the end of the DNA until it gets to the mismatch. And then the polymerase has to go back and do it again properly. So would you like to see that again?
Yes, please.
Everyone always does. I've done the experiment, goodness knows how many times. Right. So polymerase builds about 1,000 letters of DNA a second. So it takes about a second for the cell to recognise this, and it can't see inside the double helix. It notices an incredibly subtle change in the twist and the tilt of the DNA. But it knows that there's something in there that needs sorting out. And how many people, when they're word processing, you don't use the cursor to go to just that mistake, you just backspace. Yeah? The cell does that, and it's worthwhile that the cell backspaces 1,000 letters of DNA to correct one mismatch. Okay? So that's just an interesting sort of bit of perspective. And this is going on in every cell all the time, if it's dividing. So that's why it's important, because if it goes wrong, you get stutters at repetitive, especially at repetitive bits of DNA. Right, now, what we're going to do is, Tristan and I are going to do a team effort, because the whole thing is a team effort. I'll start to talk, yeah, that's mine. So, I'm going to start off by giving a bit of background, how individuals with Lynch syndrome are currently identified and get into what we call a care pathway, and how that's evolved over the years as we've understood more about Lynch syndrome. I was saying to a lady here earlier at the coffee break, I had the privilege of being in the room in the Copenhagen Medical Institute bar when the first gene was identified from the families that had been selected at the previous meeting in Amsterdam according to the famous Amsterdam criterion. And there was quite a bit of alcohol. I had a bad cold. My boss sort of went down to the ground level, and halfway through the evening, Tim Bishop sticks his hand up and says, yeah, there's a gene on chromosome 2, and it's heterogeneous. In other words, there's more than one gene. So that's quite a bit of privilege, really. Anyway, we're going to look at new ways of thinking about how we find people with Lynch, because it's beneficial to do so. Tristan is going to then tell us all about the health economics and how we can demonstrate to the health system that it would be beneficial to go looking in systematic testing. Then I'll come back and tell you what this means in the UK now, what other people are doing around the world, and future work that we might get into. Okay, so off we go. You'll all recognise the lady on the left. And I suspect most of you will clock the lady on the right. And you'll know what she's had a couple of years ago and more recently. And most people in the world, at least the Western world, now recognise that. So there is a specific Angelina Jolie effect in the education. And Lynch syndrome hasn't got there yet.
No.
It will get there. We're just a little bit delayed, and it's all to do with what we call ascertainment bias, because the familial breast ovarian genes were found before the Lynch ones. But the point is that once we get to that stage, testing will become far more acceptable, there will be much more general knowledge, and things will be getting better. We get 5 times the referrals for familial breast ovarian cancer as we do for query Lynch. And yet I'll come on to demonstrate that it should be at least parity, and actually maybe more referrals for Lynch than query BRCA. But it's all to do with perception and what people are worried about and what brings them to the doctors, as I will explain. Now, you'll recognise the young man on the right, who sadly is no longer with us. Who recognises the gent on the left? He was treated at St Mark's just before the Second World War. It's Reginald Mitchell, designer of the Spitfire. Thankfully he didn't die before he designed the Spitfire, otherwise we might not be here now. Now, he had a rectal cancer at 44. Point is, I don't know whether it was due to Lynch or not, and you couldn't tell just by looking at it. So that's the point. So what is Lynch syndrome? Well, you can look at it as being avoidable early onset cancer, and it costs money, resources and lives. And if we work and live in a social form of healthcare called the NHS, we're all paying for it. It's a bit like, what's the biggest island in the Pacific before Australia was discovered? It's Australia. It's always been there. People are currently being treated for early onset avoidable cancers, and they're really expensive. They're more expensive than the usual ones because the usual ones happen later in life and they don't cost the Chancellor much in tax. Yeah? If I can put it bluntly like that. That has actually moved politicians, by the way, saying that. That's the inside of a normal bowel, so when the doctor says, all right, I'll have a look, that can be kind of what he might see. But if he sees that, he knows instantly what he needs to do. That is familial polyposis of one sort or another. It's probably adenomatous, so he would take a biopsy and send it to the pathologist. But he knows instantly that it's not normal, something to act on, it's something familial, this person is at high risk of cancer, and boom, they're off on a care pathway. Simply with a Mark 1 eyeball, nothing fancy with scans or anything. So they know exactly what to do. But if they find that, a cancer, maybe it's Lynch, maybe not. Even if he knows what Lynch is and he's been to a talk recently and heard about it. You can't tell just by looking at it. But you can by doing some tests. And thanks to Angela and everybody for explaining about microsatellite instability. If you like, you can think of it as being stutters, particularly in repetitive bits of DNA. And these are the bits of DNA that we can test. They constitute what is part of your DNA fingerprint. These are the bits they go looking for to identify bits of tissue. We look at them to see patterns of inheritance in families. We can also look to see if they're subject to some sort of genetic instability. And if, say, we look at the one down here, the black is the normal tissue, and one end of this big tumour was coming up here, and the other end was coming up on the red. So unstable, and in slightly different ways in 2 different parts of the same tumour. Anybody heard about Jukes and Jukes staging?
Yeah.
Yeah? This is one of Jukes' original tumours that he studied at St Mark's. Great big adenoma, as it happened. 0.3 centimetre adenoma, when we can take a bit from each end. Here's some immunohistochemistry, and Angela's already showed you this. We use an antibody to the particular proteins, and it stains up whether it's there or not. So on the left, you can see that MSH2 is in some normal cells down here, and it's in the cancer here, as well as normal cells around it. Here on the right, MLH1 is here in the normal cells, and at higher power at the normal cells here, but it's not in the cancer. So MLH1 is lost, and that's associated with somebody who got cancer at a young age and had a mutation in MLH1. So this helps us get there. It tells us not just that mismatch repair has been lost, but it points the finger at one particular gene, which is really important. This test doesn't always work on all cancers. Not all mutations show themselves in the same way. There's lots to find out about it. There's umpteen different ways of doing it. I'm one of the national assessors for quality control of this. And we assess 84 labs worldwide who use 72 different techniques for all sorts of reasons which are due to technicalities usually. Anyway, how does Lynch syndrome usually find us in the medical system? And by that I mean medical genetics. Well, people can self-refer themselves because they're affected. Why have I got cancer at such a young age? It can be a relative who's worried about their family history who's otherwise well. It can be somebody who's referred themselves to a GP who then looks up the local referral criteria. Oh, you have to have a family history and there has to be somebody under a certain age, blah, blah, blah. Or it can be secondary care, a hospital doctor twigs, like Ranjit or somebody. Oh, maybe they've got this, they've got a bit of a family history. Or it can be the doctor directly who sends patients to us. Often they don't tell us they've sent them, so they turn up, as I'm sure you've experienced. Oh, what? I don't know why I was coming here. Yeah, that's a bit of a problem, but we can all get around it. The point is, all this relies on people knowing about Lynch and knowing what to do about it if they ask about it. So there's lots of ifs, buts and maybes in the equation. And actually, how good are we, that is the medical profession, the healthcare professionals, at doing that? Well, there have been a number of studies, both abroad and in the UK, and we're not actually. Even if doctors ask about a family history, they often don't know what to do about it, even if something comes up. And so that is a problem. That's a limitation. As a kind of a clinical test, and I'm a kind of more of a lab animal, so I think in terms of the specificity and sensitivity of tests. In family history, it's better than nothing, but it's not very good as a test of finding genes. Okay. Then when we look at the guidelines for which tumours to test, they're complicated, they change, nobody can remember it, and even when you do it, they vary by which gene is the underlying gene affected, and all sorts of ways. So in fact, they all struggle as well. And if you were to apply the so-called revised Bethesda guidelines, you would be testing 25% of all bowel cancers anyway. So the argument is, well, why don't I just test all of them? So we get to a stage where family history and selective tumour testing have limitations and are biased. Now, the bias in family history is because what we ask for, how we limit people getting into clinic, is that they must have a family history that's pretty strong. It must be subsequent generations. It must be relatively little cases of people who have the gene but don't get the cancer. And it has to be young onset. So we bias all our cases that we know about to being, as it were, more severe, stronger, that kind of thing. We know that most people with a family history sufficient to get into clinic do not have a mutation, because the service I direct in Cardiff, and this is in common with all the ones all over the world, is that you might test 10 families and find one mutation. So, you know, there's only a 10% yield, so you've worried 9 people about a family history, which probably doesn't mean Lynch, about when you find one. Family history may mean something else, so, you know, it's important to chase, but we need to bear that in mind. Most people with a mutation don't have a family history sufficient to get into clinic. We can work out from estimates, as I'll show you later, how much Lynch is out there, and how much Lynch we know about, because I just look on my lab database and see how many people do we know in Wales with a mutation. And there's about a 10-fold discrepancy. So at least 90% of Lynch is not identified. So that's a given. And then we have the people who are the first person in a family with a mutation, de novo. They won't have a family history. All their first-degree relatives will have one, but they don't. So nobody takes notice of them unless they get one cancer at 35 or two by the age of 40 or something. If having survived the first one. And people who are adopted who don't have family histories. So when we tile that up, it's not so good. You know, it's grown up that way because looking at family histories is a great way of identifying genes in the first place as being the causative agents of biology. But they're not very good for clinical case finding. And the Amsterdam criteria were merely invented to boil off the creme de la creme of families with bowel cancer in order to find what genes were causing Lynch syndrome. They weren't designed as clinical selective criteria. So we need to bear in mind the history to appreciate the limitations. And it struck me that I was at a meeting run by Bowel Cancer UK last year to educate GPs. And the GP on their advisory board was talking, and she said, we see people every day who might have bowel cancer. We diagnose 2 or 3 a year who actually do. And if you think of it in those terms, how on earth are any of our colleagues going to remember this amongst all the other stuff? And I just remembered, I should have put up that picture of poor Homer Simpson holding his head in anguish. Oh, all the new stuff. Whenever I learn something new, it pushes out some of the old stuff. You know, how do we keep track of all this? I've been trying to keep up with my medical education ever since I graduated. I tell you, it goes like that. You become super specialised because you just cannot keep track of all this stuff. And that's why it has to be a team effort. Okay, so we need to look for a way to find Lynch syndrome which doesn't depend on people remembering too much stuff, if anything. And when it's found, tell them what to do. Your dashboard will tell you when your engine's conked out, when it's run out of oil, when something's getting too hot. And for those of us who need a reminder about dates, like most blokes, Facebook, your phone, your Outlook diary will tell you, oh, it's my wife's birthday next week, or it's our anniversary tomorrow, you know. Not that I forget, but you know, it's always useful to have a backup, isn't it? So there you are, you appreciate the thing. You get told when you need to do it, you get told when something has been found and what you need to do about it. If you're in an airplane cockpit and a plane starts to stall, the stick will judder and it will start saying, warning, stall, nose down. Yeah? The pilot, I'm sure, knows to do that, but they may be disoriented, in bad weather, something's happened, so it will tell them, do this, do that, we found this. So, what are we talking about actually in practical terms? Well, doing in the UK what some other, and I've taken out the word civilised, which is the word I had in my presentation to governmental authorities, do what some other civilised countries already do, like Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands. Even the United States does it. The driver there is because they know they will have the pantsuit off them if they don't find a family with a condition that they could have avoided cancers in. So it's a different driver of quality, but I could care less what the driver is. Find individuals and families with Lynch by systematically testing cancers instead of waiting for them to present. And as a medical colleague said who has Lynch themselves, they said, our cancers are unanswered referral letters. And I thought, that's a pretty way of putting it, isn't it? It's there, we just don't see it for what it is. And an Australian colleague, I took a line off one of their slides, 10% of all cancer occurs under the age of 50, but it accounts for 25% of the life lost due to cancer. Because you appreciate most cancers occur, you know, somewhat after people have retired. And so I can tell you that, you accept it, that at least 90% of Lynch in the UK is undiagnosed. There's a lot of it out there. So, how are we going to do it? Well, by changing the Royal College of Pathologists' guidelines for testing bowel cancers, and I should explain that RC-Path guidelines carry big teeth. They're not like NICE guidance, which can be ignored at the whim of ministers and people interpreting it. RC-Path guidelines have to be adhered to, because laboratories have to be accredited, And if the accrediting authority, which is the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, comes in and looks and finds against an audit that you are not complying with professional guidance, you will have your ticket pulled. And that has very serious consequences for that laboratory. So it has the teeth of, if you don't do it, bad stuff. So it's quite a good dog actually for setting on the things. And you know, we thought, okay, what we need to aim for is to get that changed to all bowel cancers up to a certain age should be tested for Lynch, and if found, we have that written in the report. So that goes back to the clinicians, it tells them what it is, what they do about it. They don't need to remember anything else, they don't even need to know about Lynch, just to refer. Then the experts, like Angela and her team, can take over from there. And you can be offered your options and take them up if you want. But at least you haven't missed out on the opportunity of finding out you've got something that will save your life. My colleague in Norway told me, I said, have you got, can you send me a copy of what you put to your government? He says, no. I said, why? He said, I just went to them and told them they should do it. And it was unethical not to tell people about a potentially life-saving diagnosis. And they said, yeah, all right. That's a kind of nice sort of, tells you something nice about the Scandinavian attitude to social healthcare. Oncologists already want microsatellite instability testing because in certain stages of bowel cancer it tells them which chemotherapy will work better than others. Okay, so if you're going to start screening something, and usually we're talking about screening everybody for something, but actually we're talking screening of cancer, not for cancer here, but whatever, the principles still apply. There has to be an effective intervention, and we have that, colonoscopy at least, aspirin is coming along, there may be other interventions as Ranjit pointed out. And also, you have to prove that the cost of doing it is worth it in terms of what you will save the system. And that is where this comes in. At the turn of the century, I was involved in introducing MSI and immunohistochemistry as tests. And I speculated in the appendix of a report on the policy for East Anglia for screening or for surveillance of those at increased risk of bowel cancer, that perhaps, well, if we're going to have a system for testing the tumours of people who come onto clinic, we ought to also test cancers that start turning up every day, every week in our multidisciplinary team meetings. And we could do that, and it wouldn't cost very much, and I predicted how much it would find. Anyway, that's there. Under the National Screening Committee, we had a meeting a few years later on implementing testing for MSI and immunohistochemistry across the UK, and that's why it is now available across the UK. And part of that, we set up quality control schemes to make sure the tests are done properly, because that is something you have to get done. It's not a question of everybody just doing what they want. And as part of the Mallorca group, which Ranjit has mentioned, I'm a member of that, and we issued guidelines for the clinical management of Lynch syndrome a couple of years later, and then we put out a paper on recommendations to improve identification of hereditary colorectal cancer in Europe, and this then led to, through the good services of my colleague Diana Eccles in Southampton, because the National Health Service's Health Technology Assessment Programme is run out of the University of Southampton. And she said, we ought to put to them that they consider a scheme for consideration of the technology to do this, diagnostic strategies for HNPCC as it was called at the time. But it basically said, what is the utility and cost effectiveness of genetic testing for Lynch syndrome in all newly diagnosed persons with colorectal cancer under 50, and of strategies to test their relations. And that went out into the system as a brief, and it's really nice that it was picked up by the department that Tristan works in, which is the Peninsula Technology Advisory Group. And their day job is considering these frighteningly expensive new drugs that have to be considered by NICE. So they are professional health economists, the rest of us are all amateurs. I should point out that at the turn of the century when I wrote that bit of paper, I was continually being teed off by people telling me, you can't bring these tests in because they cost too much. And I'm thinking, 200 quid? Do you realise how much a colonoscopy costs? Do you realise how much a bowel cancer costs? In the money, let alone the human cost. And I worked out on the back of an envelope when a family with probably Barned or Lynch didn't turn up one day, what would I have cost the NHS if they turned up and I prescribed colonoscopy for the next 20 years? And you're talking about £1/8 pounds, which would have been substantially reduced, even by my crude calculations, if I'd been able to do some genetic testing. So I'll hand over now to Tristan. He can give you the expert view.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk. It's really special to actually get to meet people with Lynch syndrome and to share a platform with people who have known about it for years and are experts. And I really look forward to meeting people over lunch and later on in the day. But I'll get on, sorry. So, as Ian said, the National Institute for Health Research has a health technology assessment program. And what they generally do is they look at drugs or things that you might do in the health service and they say, do we think they're going to work and do we think they're going to be good value for money? And as Ian says, normally my job is, what is the cost effectiveness of unpronounceable drug for type of cancer you haven't heard of after everything else has failed. But this one looked a little different and it ended up getting assigned to us. And I hadn't heard of HNPCC or Lynch syndrome before this project. And now I'm here and I just feel really blessed. So I'll crack on, sorry. So thanks to you all for inviting me. Thank you to the NIHR HTA programme for deciding that this was something that they would fund. And also, it's not a one-man band at Pentag. I had lots of other people working on the project. So thanks to them. Just an overview of the little bit of the talk that I'm going to be giving. First, I'll make sure that we're all clear exactly what I'm talking about when I say systematic testing of colorectal cancers. Then I'll talk about how you measure health benefits when you want to talk to people in suits making decisions. And then I'll talk about cost effectiveness. And finally, the research that we did. So when we say systematic testing of colorectal cancers, we're talking about new bowel cancer patients. They've got to meet certain criteria and you offer them a laboratory test to see if they have Lynch syndrome or if they're likely to have Lynch syndrome. You could have various criteria, so you might say they've got to be under a certain age, or you might say they've got to have a certain family history. And then there are options for what tests you might do. So Ian talked about some tests that you can do on the tumour. Some people are also saying, well, maybe you could go straight away to testing people's DNA that they would pass on to their children. Assuming that you do tumour tests, the idea is that if the tumour test suggests that Lynch syndrome is likely, then you would go on and do that DNA testing. Otherwise, you would assume that they don't have Lynch syndrome, and tests aren't perfect. Some people might have Lynch syndrome, but it doesn't show up in their tumour test. Measuring health benefits. So we normally think in what health economists call natural units. So bowel cancers prevented, you'd say, well, we stopped this many bowel cancers from happening because we did surveillance, or other cancers, or deaths from cancer prevented. So you want to say, for example, if we brought this in, we would stop 20 people a year dying, or something like that. And to you, that seems like a good thing to do. But then the question gets asked, well, how do we really know what those things are worth compared to other things that the health service does, such as hip replacements, or doing a liver transplant, or giving somebody chemotherapy for their cancer? So the way that they do that is they calculate a quality adjusted life year, and they call that a QALY. You may have heard of it, you may not have done, but it's quite simple. So you multiply two things. First of all, the quality of life,